Ethan Cole, 32 years old, single father, a man who'd always lived in shadows, stood before his ex-wife's wedding reception with his only worn suit and a heart full of dread. He knew they were waiting for him to fail. They wanted to see him broken. But just as he prepared to surrender, a luxury car rolled up. The door opened, and the woman who stepped out would change everything. This is a story about a man who found his worth again, not through money, but through self-respect. Stay until the end, hit like, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Ethan Cole had learned to make himself invisible. It wasn't a skill he'd set out to master. It wasn't something he'd put on a resume or mentioned at parent-teacher conferences. But over the years, as life pressed down on him with the weight of responsibility and the sting of failure, he'd figured out how to move through rooms without taking up space, how to answer questions without offering opinions, how to exist in the margins of other people's lives while his own shrank to the size of a single priority. Mia, his daughter, 7 years old, dark curls that refused to be tamed, eyes that saw too much. She was the reason he woke up at 5:30 every morning, before the sun crept over the horizon, before the world demanded anything from him. Those quiet moments in the kitchen, making coffee in the dark, were the only ones that belonged entirely to him. The rest of the day was a carefully choreographed performance of competence, of keeping everything together even when the seams were fraying. He was the reason he ironed his shirts even when the collar was frayed, the reason he smiled when his jaw ached and nodded when his pride screamed. Every decision he made, every sacrifice, every moment of swallowed anger or suppressed disappointment, it all came back to her. And she was the reason he was standing outside the Grandview estate on a Saturday afternoon in late September, holding an embossed invitation that felt like a sentencing document, watching luxury cars pull up to the valet station one after another. The envelope had arrived 3 weeks ago. Cream-colored paper, heavy stock, the kind that whispered money before you even opened it. Gold lettering, his ex-wife's new last name printed in elegant script beneath her first. Claire Whitmore. Not Claire Cole anymore. Never Claire Cole again. That name had been discarded like an old coat that no longer fit, replaced with something that carried more weight, more prestige, more everything that Ethan had never been able to provide. He'd stared at it for a full minute before opening it, already knowing what was inside, already feeling the punch to his gut that came with the confirmation. The invitation itself was a work of art, probably designed by someone whose hourly rate exceeded what Ethan made in a day. Calligraphy that looked hand-done, a small silk ribbon holding the response card in place. You are cordially invited to celebrate the marriage of Claire Brennan and Jonathan Whitmore. Cordially? As if there was anything cordial about it. As if the invitation wasn't a carefully constructed reminder of everything Ethan had failed to be, everything he'd never become. Claire had moved on, moved up, found someone who could give her the life she'd always wanted, and Ethan was expected to show up, smile, and pretend it didn't gut him. He'd almost thrown it away, almost convinced himself that showing up would be a mistake, that Claire didn't actually want him there, that the invitation was just a formality sent out of obligation, or worse, pity. Maybe even cruelty dressed up as civility. But then Mia had found it on the kitchen counter, her small fingers tracing the gold border with wonder. "Is this from Mom?" she'd asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of hope that children had before the world taught them to expect disappointment. "Yeah." "Are we going?" And there it was. The question that changed everything, because Mia didn't ask if he was going. She asked if they were going, as if it were a given. As if her mother's wedding was something they'd attend together, like a school play or a birthday party. As if Ethan showing up to watch his ex-wife marry a man who represented everything he wasn't would be normal, expected, fine. Ethan had looked at his daughter, at the hope in her eyes, the quiet expectation that her parents could exist in the same space without the world imploding, and he'd known he couldn't say no. Couldn't explain that walking into that room would feel like admitting defeat. Couldn't tell her that every fiber of his being wanted to avoid the humiliation that was surely waiting for him. "Yeah," he'd said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're going." Now, 3 weeks later, he was regretting that decision with every fiber of his being. The Grandview estate was the kind of place that existed to remind people like Ethan that they didn't belong. Sprawling gardens that looked like they'd been transplanted from a European manor. A fountain in the circular driveway that probably cost more than his annual salary, water cascading over tiers of sculpted stone. Valets in crisp uniforms taking keys to cars Ethan couldn't afford to insure, let alone own. Mercedes, BMWs. A Tesla that gleamed like it had never seen rain. The building itself was a monument to wealth. White stone facade, tall windows with actual shutters that probably weren't just decorative, a chandelier visible even from the driveway that looked like it belonged in a palace. The kind of place where people got married when they wanted everyone to know they'd made it. Ethan adjusted his tie for the fourth time. It was the same tie he'd worn to every job interview for the past 5 years. Navy blue, unremarkable, safe. The kind of tie that didn't draw attention, which was exactly what Ethan wanted. To blend in, to be overlooked, to get through this day without incident. "Daddy, you look nice." He glanced down at Mia. She was wearing the dress they'd picked out together last weekend, pale pink with a white sash, a bow at the back that she'd insisted on, even though it added $15 to the price. It was the most expensive thing he'd bought in months, and even then, he'd waited for it to go on sale. Had checked 3 different stores to find the best price, had counted the bills twice before handing them to the cashier. "Thanks, sweetheart." He forced a smile, the muscles in his face protesting the effort. "You look beautiful." She beamed, spinning once so the skirt flared out. For a moment, Ethan forgot where they were. Forgot the knot in his stomach that had been tightening since he woke up this morning. Forgot the voices in his head that kept whispering, "You don't belong here. They're going to know. They're going to see right through you." Then the valet opened the door to a silver Mercedes and a couple stepped out, mid-50s, dripping in designer labels that Ethan only recognized because Claire used to point them out in magazines. And the moment shattered. "Ethan Cole?" He turned. The woman approaching was someone he vaguely recognized from Claire's social circle back when they'd still been married, back when he'd tried to fit into her world and failed spectacularly. Perfectly blown-out hair that looked like it had been done that morning at a salon that didn't list prices on their website. Heels that could double as weapons, sharp enough to draw blood. A smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile people wore when they were assessing you and finding you lacking. "Hi," Ethan said, because what else was there to say? "I almost didn't recognize you." Her gaze swept over him, lingering on his worn shoes, the ones he'd polished last night, hoping they'd look less scuffed, less cheap, less like everything else about him. "It's been so long." "Yeah, busy." "I'm sure." She glanced at Mia, her expression softening fractionally, the way people's faces changed when they looked at children, as if innocence demanded at least a veneer of kindness. "And this must be Mia! You've gotten so big!" Mia pressed closer to Ethan's leg, shy in the way she always was around strangers, her small hand wrapping around his with a grip that felt like an anchor. "She has," Ethan said, his free hand settling protectively on her shoulder. "Well," the woman's smile sharpened, taking on an edge that made Ethan's spine stiffen. "Claire will be so glad you made it. She wasn't sure you'd come." There was something in the way she said it. A subtext Ethan couldn't quite name, but felt in his chest like a bruise forming under the skin. Like she knew something he didn't. Like his attendance was the subject of conversation, of speculation, of bets placed on whether he'd have the nerve to show his face. "Wouldn't miss it," he said, even though that was a lie. Even though he'd spent the past 3 weeks thinking of excuses, of reasons he could give Mia for why they couldn't go, of ways to avoid this exact moment. The woman nodded, her attention already drifting toward someone more interesting, someone more worth her time, and walked away without another word, her heels clicking against the stone pavement like a countdown. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath shaky. "Are you okay, Daddy?" He looked down at Mia. She was frowning, her small face creased with concern that no 7-year-old should have to feel for her parent. "I'm fine," he said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. "Let's go inside." The reception hall was worse than he'd imagined, and he'd imagined it pretty thoroughly during the sleepless nights leading up to today. Vaulted ceilings that seemed to stretch up forever, making the space feel both grand and intimidating. Crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls, catching the light and scattering it across the room in 1,000 tiny rainbows. Tables draped in white linen so pristine it looked like no one had ever dared to touch it. Each centerpiece a small fortune in roses and orchids arranged with the kind of precision that came from hiring professionals. A string quartet played softly in the corner, something classical that Ethan didn't recognize but that sounded expensive, refined, like the kind of music that required an education to appreciate. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne and crystal flutes and hors d'oeuvres that Ethan couldn't pronounce. Tiny works of art that were probably meant to be eaten in one bite but looked too elaborate to disturb. And everywhere were people who belonged. They moved through the space with an ease Ethan had never possessed, would never possess. Laughter that sounded effortless, unforced, the kind that came from never having to worry about rent or medical bills or whether you could afford new shoes for your kid. Conversations that flowed like water, smooth and natural, about vacation homes and market trends and private schools. They wore their wealth casually, the way Ethan wore his exhaustion, like a second skin they'd long since stopped noticing. He found a table near the back, away from the center of attention, away from the head table where Claire and Jonathan would eventually sit. He guided Mia into a chair, helping her settle, making sure she was comfortable. "Can I get some juice?" she asked, her eyes wide as she took in the spectacle around them. "Sure. Stay here, okay?" He flagged down a waiter, requested apple juice, and watched as Mia's eyes went wide at the spread of food being carried past. Shrimp arranged in perfect spirals, tiny cakes that looked like they belonged in a bakery window, things on toothpicks that looked more like art than appetizers, garnished with herbs Ethan couldn't name. Ethan's stomach growled. He'd skipped lunch, too anxious to eat, his appetite killed by the dread that had been building all week. Now, surrounded by food he couldn't afford to buy and didn't know how to eat properly, the hunger felt like mockery. "Ethan!" He turned, and there she was, Claire. She looked exactly the way he'd expected and nothing like the woman he'd married. Her dress was custom, he could tell, the kind of fit that only came from multiple fittings, from a designer who understood how to make fabric move like liquid. Ivory silk that hugged her frame before spilling into a train that probably cost more than his rent. Her hair was pinned up in some elaborate style that must have taken hours, diamonds glinting at her ears and throat, catching the light with every movement. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Untouchable. Perfect. A stranger wearing the face of someone he used to know. "Claire?" He stood awkward, unsure if he was supposed to hug her, or shake her hand, or just nod. The etiquette of greeting your ex-wife at her wedding to someone else wasn't covered in any manual he'd ever read. "Congratulations. Thank you for coming." Her smile was polite, professional. The kind of smile she probably gave to clients at work, to people she needed to impress but didn't actually care about. "I wasn't sure you would." "Mia wanted to be here." Of course, make it about Mia, never about him. Never about the fact that maybe, just maybe, some part of him wanted to see Claire happy, even if it wasn't with him. Or maybe he just wanted to torture himself, to confirm what he already knew, that she was better off without him. Claire's gaze shifted to their daughter, and for a second something genuine flickered across her face. Something that looked like love, like regret, like all the complicated emotions that came with being a mother who'd chosen a different life. "Hi, baby." "Hi, Mom." Mia's voice was small, uncertain in a way that made Ethan's chest ache. Claire crouched down, careful not to wrinkle her dress, and kissed Mia's forehead. The gesture was tender, real, and it reminded Ethan that Claire wasn't a villain. She was just a person who'd made different choices, who'd wanted different things. "You look so pretty." "Daddy bought me this dress." "Did he?" Claire glanced up at Ethan, and he couldn't read her expression. Couldn't tell if she was grateful or pitying or just making conversation. That was sweet of him. There was a pause. Uncomfortable. Heavy. The kind of silence that filled with everything they weren't saying, all the words that had been left unsaid for 5 years. "Well," Claire said, straightening, smoothing her dress with hands that trembled just slightly. "I should get back. Jonathan's family is here, and—" She stopped, as if remembering something. As if the script in her head had a note she'd almost missed. "Oh, you'll meet him later. I think you'll like him." Ethan doubted that, but he nodded anyway, playing his part in this performance. "I'm sure he's great." Claire left, her train swishing behind her like a cape, and Ethan sat back down, feeling like he'd just survived the first round of something he didn't know how to win. "She's really happy," Mia said quietly, her small voice cutting through the noise around them. Ethan looked at his daughter, at the way she was watching her mother disappear into the crowd. Yeah, she is. Are you happy, Daddy? The question hit him harder than it should have. He opened his mouth, then closed it. What was he supposed to say? That he was barely keeping his head above water? That some days he woke up and didn't recognize his own life, didn't know how he'd ended up here, alone and struggling and so damn tired? That happiness felt like a luxury he couldn't afford, something other people got to have while he just survived. I'm happy when I'm with you, he said finally, and it was the truest thing he'd said all day. Mia seemed to accept that. She turned her attention to the juice that had arrived, sipping it through a straw, while Ethan tried to ignore the eyes he felt on him from across the room. The whispers, the glances, the way people looked at him and then looked away, like he was something unfortunate they'd rather not acknowledge. The ceremony itself was short, efficient, the kind of wedding that cost a fortune but moved quickly because everyone involved had places to be, things to do, lives that couldn't be interrupted for too long. Jonathan Whitmore was everything Ethan wasn't, tall, confident, with the kind of smile that suggested he'd never doubted himself a day in his life. He worked in finance, owned a company, from what Ethan had gathered from Mia's casual mentions over the past few months. The kind of man who wore cufflinks that probably cost more than Ethan's car, who knew which fork to use at fancy dinners, who'd never had to check his bank account before buying groceries. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, Ethan felt a wild, irrational urge to stand up. Not because he wanted Claire back. He didn't. That ship had sailed years ago, sunk somewhere in the depths of their failed marriage. But because sitting there, watching her marry someone who represented everything he'd failed to be, felt like being erased. Like the universe was confirming what he'd always suspected, that he wasn't enough, had never been enough, would never be enough. He stayed silent, hands clenched in his lap until his knuckles went white. After the vows, after the kiss that lasted just a beat too long, after the applause that echoed through the vaulted space like thunder, the reception shifted into full swing. Dinner was served, filet mignon cooked to perfection, roasted vegetables that actually looked appetizing, some kind of glaze Ethan didn't recognize but that tasted better than anything he'd made in his own kitchen in years. Ethan picked at his plate while Mia ate with the kind of focus only a 7-year-old could muster, completely absorbed in the task of cutting her meat into tiny pieces and arranging them just so. Ethan Cole! He looked up. A man he didn't recognize stood beside the table. Late 40s, expensive suit that fit like it had been made for him. A glass of scotch in one hand that he held like a prop in a play. That's me. Richard Brennan, Claire's cousin. Ethan nodded. He vaguely remembered the name from wedding planning years ago, from family gatherings he'd attended and felt out of place at, from conversations where he'd smiled and nodded and never quite understood what everyone was talking about. Heard a lot about you, Richard said, though his tone suggested none of it was good. Like he'd been briefed on Ethan's failures, on all the ways he'd disappointed Claire, on the reasons the marriage had ended. You're the assistant, right, to some businesswoman? The way he said it, assistant, businesswoman, made it sound lesser than it was. Like Ethan was a secretary, a glorified errand boy, someone who fetched coffee and took notes and didn't matter. Personal assistant, Ethan corrected, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. To Ava Sterling. Richard's eyebrows lifted. Ava Sterling? The Ava Sterling? Yeah. Huh. Richard took a sip of his drink, his gaze assessing, calculating. Didn't realize you worked for someone like that. There was something in the way he said it, like it was surprising, like Ethan didn't seem competent enough to work for someone successful, someone who mattered. Like surely there'd been a mistake, a clerical error, some reason that Ava Sterling had ended up with Ethan Cole as her right hand. She's great to work for, Ethan said evenly, keeping his voice neutral, even as his blood pressure rose. I'm sure. Richard's smile didn't quite land, hovering somewhere between condescending and pitying. Must be tough, though. Single dad, demanding job. How do you manage? It was a question designed to sound sympathetic, but Ethan heard the judgment underneath. The implication that he probably didn't manage, that he was probably failing at both, that his daughter was probably suffering and his work was probably subpar, and he was probably just barely holding it together. I manage, he said, his jaw tight. Well, Richard clapped him on the shoulder too hard, like they were old friends instead of strangers performing civility. Good for you, man. Seriously, takes guts to keep going after. He stopped, as if realizing he'd said too much, as if the rest of the sentence was too cruel to say out loud. Anyway, enjoy the night. He walked away, and Ethan sat there, his hands clenched under the table, his breathing shallow. Daddy? He forced himself to relax, to unclench his fists, to plaster on a smile that felt like it might crack his face. Yeah, sweetheart? Can we dance later? He looked at her. At the hope in her eyes, the simple request that had nothing to do with money or status or any of the bullshit swirling around them. Yeah, we can dance. The evening dragged on. Toasts were made. Jonathan's best man told a story about a yacht trip in Greece that made everyone laugh like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, like owning a yacht, and sailing to Greece was just a normal Tuesday. Claire's maid of honor gave a speech about true love and second chances that felt pointed, deliberate, like every word was designed to remind Ethan that Claire had found what she'd been looking for, just not with him. And Ethan felt his chest tighten with every word, every laugh, every casual mention of things he'd never be able to afford or experience or give to anyone. He excused himself to use the restroom, needing a moment away from the noise, the laughter, the casual cruelty of people who didn't even realize they were being cruel, because this was just their lives, their normal, their baseline. The hallway was quieter, cooler. Ethan leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, trying to breathe, trying to center himself, trying to remember why he'd thought this was a good idea. Didn't think you'd actually show. He opened his eyes. Claire's brother, Mark, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, a drink in his hand and a smirk on his face. Mia wanted to come, Ethan said, too tired to pretend, too worn down to play whatever game Mark wanted to play. Yeah, well, Mark shrugged like Ethan's presence was amusing, pathetic, something to be observed and mocked. Takes balls, I'll give you that. Walking in here, knowing everyone's comparing you to Jonathan. I'm not trying to compete with Jonathan. Good, because you'd lose. Mark's grin was sharp, cutting. No offense. None taken, Ethan lied. Mark studied him for a moment, his head tilted like he was trying to figure something out, trying to understand what Claire had ever seen in this man, who couldn't even afford a decent suit. Then he shook his head. You know what I don't get? How someone like you ended up with Claire in the first place. I mean, He gestured vaguely, as if Claire's worth was self-evident, as if it should be obvious to everyone. And I'm what? You know? Mark's tone was almost pitying, like he was doing Ethan a favor by not spelling it out. Just a guy. Ethan felt something crack inside him. Not break, just crack. A hairline fracture that had been forming for years, spreading a little wider with every slight, every dismissal, every moment when someone looked at him and found him wanting. Yeah, he said quietly. Just a guy. Mark clapped him on the shoulder, gentler than Richard, but no less condescending, and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there in the empty hallway, staring at nothing. He stood there for a long moment, trying to pull himself together, trying to remember how to breathe normally, how to walk back into that room and pretend everything was fine. Then he pushed off the wall and went back to the reception. Mia was still at the table, drawing on a napkin with a pen she'd borrowed from someone. She looked up when he sat down, her smile bright and uncomplicated, and the only good thing about this entire day. I drew us, she said, holding up the napkin. It was a stick figure rendering of the two of them, holding hands. Above them, she'd drawn a sun with rays that looked like eyelashes. It's perfect, Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The band started playing something slow, and couples moved onto the dance floor. Claire and Jonathan were at the center, swaying together like they'd been doing this forever, like they fit in a way Ethan and Claire never had, and Ethan forced himself to look away before the bitterness could take root. Can we dance now? Mia asked. Yeah. He stood, offering his hand. Let's dance. They moved to the edge of the floor, away from the spotlight, away from the center where Claire and Jonathan were being photographed by a professional who'd probably been paid more for this one event than Ethan made in a month. Ethan held his daughter's hands as she stood on his shoes, giggling as he swayed them back and forth, her weight barely registering. For a few minutes, it was just the two of them. The music. The moment. Everything else faded into background noise. And then someone laughed. Loud. Cutting through the song like a knife. and Ethan looked over to see a group of women watching them. One of them whispered something, her hand covering her mouth, and the others laughed again, the sound sharp and knowing. Mia didn't notice. She was too busy spinning, her dress twirling, her face lit up with joy. But Ethan noticed. He always noticed. When the song ended, he guided Mia back to their table. She was yawning now, the long day catching up with her, the excitement wearing off and leaving exhaustion in its wake. "Tired?" he asked. She nodded, rubbing her eyes with small fists. "We can leave soon," he promised, and the relief he felt at those words was almost overwhelming. "Okay." Ethan glanced around the room one last time, at the people laughing, drinking, celebrating, at Claire, radiant beside her new husband, surrounded by people who fit into her world in ways Ethan never had, at the life she'd built without him, the future she'd chosen that didn't include him except as a footnote, a first marriage that hadn't worked out, a mistake corrected. And he realized something. He didn't belong here. He never had. The only reason he'd come was because Mia had asked, because he didn't want her to feel ashamed of him, didn't want her to grow up thinking her father was someone who hid from hard things, because he'd thought, stupidly, naively, that showing up would prove something, that it would demonstrate strength, resilience, dignity. But all it had proven was that some gaps couldn't be bridged, some distances were too far to cross, some worlds weren't meant to overlap. He stood, helping Mia into her coat, the small pink jacket that matched her dress. "We're leaving?" she asked. "Yeah, let's go home." They made their way toward the exit, weaving through the crowd, Ethan keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact, just trying to get out without another conversation, another reminder of how small he was in this world of giants. They were almost at the door when someone called his name. "Ethan." He turned, knowing who it would be before he saw him. Jonathan Whitmore stood there, hand extended, his smile easy and practiced, and probably genuine in the way that came naturally to people who'd never struggled. "Glad you could make it," Jonathan said. Ethan shook his hand because refusing would have been childish, would have made this about him when it wasn't, when it couldn't be. "Congratulations," he said, the word ashes in his mouth. "Thanks." Jonathan glanced at Mia, his expression softening in that universal way adults' faces changed when they looked at children. "And you must be Mia. Your mom talks about you all the time." Mia nodded shyly, pressing closer to Ethan's leg. "Well," Jonathan's gaze returned to Ethan. "I just wanted to say, I appreciate you being here. I know it's not easy." There was something in his tone, not quite pity, not quite sympathy, but close. Like he knew, like Claire had told him, like everyone in this room understood that Ethan being here was an act of either courage or masochism, and no one was quite sure which. "It's fine," Ethan said, his voice flat, empty. "Claire's told me a lot about you," Jonathan continued, apparently not picking up on Ethan's desire to end this conversation and escape. "About how hard you work, how much you care about Mia. That's admirable. Admirable. Like Ethan was a charity case, a feel-good story, a man doing his best with limited resources, worthy of a patronizing pat on the head." "Thanks," Ethan said. Jonathan seemed to sense the tension, the way Ethan's shoulders had gone rigid, the way his smile had frozen into something that didn't reach his eyes. His own smile faltered, just slightly. "Anyway, drive safe." "Yeah, you too." Ethan turned and walked out, Mia's hand in his, and didn't look back. Didn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing whatever expression was on his face right now. The air outside was cold, sharp against his skin after the warmth of the reception hall. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself, trying to shake off the weight of the past 3 hours. "Daddy, are you okay?" He looked down at Mia. She was watching him with those two perceptive eyes, and he realized his hands were shaking, trembling like leaves in wind. "I'm fine," he lied, and hated himself for it. They walked toward the parking lot, past the valets who were still opening doors for guests, past the luxury cars gleaming under the lights like jewels on display. Ethan's car, a 10-year-old sedan with a dent in the bumper from when he'd backed into a pole 2 years ago and couldn't afford to fix it, sat at the far end, almost hidden in the shadows where cars like his belonged. He unlocked it, helped Mia into her booster seat, made sure she was buckled in safely, and closed the door with more force than necessary. Then he stood there, one hand on the roof, staring at nothing, feeling everything. He thought he could do this, thought he could walk into that room and hold his head high, thought he could prove to Claire, to himself, to everyone who'd ever looked at him and found him lacking, that he was fine, that he was enough, that their judgment didn't touch him. But he wasn't fine, and he wasn't enough. And the worst part was, he didn't know if he ever would be. He was about to get into the car when he heard it, the low purr of an engine that sounded expensive, refined, nothing like the rattle his own car made on cold mornings. He turned, and his breath caught in his throat. A sleek black car was pulling into the lot, something expensive, something that didn't belong in the same universe as his dented sedan. German, probably. The kind of car that came with features Ethan had never heard of, that cost more than he'd make in 5 years. It rolled to a stop a few feet away, silent except for that purr, and the driver's door opened. And Ava Sterling stepped out. She was dressed simply, navy dress that probably cost more than his rent, but didn't look it, heels that were elegant without being ostentatious, hair loose around her shoulders instead of the tight bun she usually wore to the office. But she carried herself with the kind of confidence that made simple look extraordinary, that made everyone around her seem diminished just by proximity. Ethan stared, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. "Ava?" She closed the door, her gaze steady, calm, like showing up at his ex-wife's wedding was a perfectly normal thing to do on a Saturday evening. "Hi, Ethan. What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." She glanced toward the estate, then back at him, her expression softening. "But I think I already know." Ethan's mind was reeling, trying to understand how she knew, why she was here, what this meant. "How did you—" "You left your calendar open on your desk yesterday," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "I saw the event, ex-wife's wedding." She paused, and something flickered across her face. Concern, maybe, or understanding. "You didn't seem like yourself this week. I put two and two together." He didn't know what to say. Couldn't find words for the jumble of emotions crashing through him. Ava stepped closer, her expression softening in a way he'd never seen at work, where she was all business and efficiency and controlled professionalism. "I wasn't planning to come. I figured you'd handle it. You always do." She hesitated, like she was choosing her next words carefully. "But then I thought about what that might mean. Handling it. And I realized you probably shouldn't have to, not alone." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was wound so tight it was cutting off circulation, making it hard to breathe. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I know." Ava's smile was small, genuine, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and changed her whole face. "But I wanted to." For a moment they just stood there, the space between them filled with something Ethan couldn't name. Something that felt like possibility, like hope, like maybe he wasn't as alone as he'd thought. Then Ava nodded toward the estate, toward the lights and music and people who'd spent the evening making Ethan feel small. "So, are we going back in, or are you planning to hide in the parking lot all night?" Ethan blinked, certain he'd misheard. "You want to go in? You came all this way," she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. "Might as well finish what you started." He looked at her. At this woman who'd seen him at his lowest, who'd watched him struggle and never once made him feel small, who was standing here now offering him something he didn't deserve but desperately needed. A second chance. He glanced at the car, where Mia was watching through the window, her eyes wide with curiosity and something that might have been hope. Then he looked back at Ava, at the woman who'd somehow known exactly what he needed without him saying a word. "Okay," he said, his voice stronger now. "Let's go." Ava's heels clicked against the pavement as she walked beside him, and Ethan realized he was still processing the fact that she was here, that she'd driven across town on a Saturday evening, probably canceling whatever plans someone like her had on weekends, to show up at his ex-wife's wedding because she'd somehow sensed he needed backup. The thought was overwhelming in a way that made his chest feel too tight and too full at the same time. "Is that Mia?" Ava asked, glancing toward the car where his daughter's face was pressed against the window. "Yeah." Ethan opened the door, the hinges creaking in a way that made him wince. "Mia, this is Miss Sterling. She works with Daddy." Mia looked up at Ava with wide eyes, taking in the elegant dress, the confident posture, the way she stood like she belonged anywhere she chose to be. Hi. Hi, Mia. Ava crouched down, bringing herself to eye level in a move that surprised Ethan with its naturalness. Most people in Ava's position wouldn't bother, would talk down to kids literally and figuratively. I've heard so much about you. Your dad talks about you all the time. Mia's cheeks flushed pink, pleasure and shyness mixing on her small face. He does? Every single day. Ava smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made people feel seen, valued, like they mattered. He told me you're really good at drawing. I like to draw, Mia said, her voice getting stronger, less shy. I drew a picture today of me and Daddy dancing. I'd love to see it sometime. Mia nodded eagerly, already unbuckling her seatbelt, ready to go back into the building she'd been so tired of just minutes ago. Ethan felt something shift in his chest as he watched them interact. He'd worked for Ava for 3 years, and in all that time she'd been professional, efficient, occasionally demanding when deadlines loomed. But he'd never seen this side of her. The warmth, the ease with kids, the way she made Mia feel important without even trying. Ava straightened, turning to Ethan. Ready? He wasn't, not even close, but he nodded anyway because walking away now would mean explaining why, and he didn't have the energy for that conversation. Didn't have words for the relief he felt at not having to face that room alone again. They walked back toward the estate together, Mia between them, holding both their hands. Her small fingers wrapped around Ethan's with familiar trust, around Ava's with curious hope. Ethan could feel his pulse hammering in his throat, could feel sweat gathering at the small of his back despite the cool evening air. This was a mistake. He should have just left, should have driven home and forgotten the whole night, let it fade into the category of bad memories he tried not to examine too closely. But Ava was here now, and walking away would mean admitting defeat, would mean letting those people win, and something stubborn in him refused to give them that satisfaction. The reception hall looked exactly the same as when he'd left. Same chandeliers casting the same golden light, same laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling, same people who'd spent the past hour reminding him in 100 small ways that he didn't belong. But when Ethan walked back in with Ava beside him, something fundamental changed. Conversation stuttered mid-sentence. Heads turned like flowers following the sun. Eyes widened with recognition that bordered on shock. Ava didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, she didn't care. She walked with the kind of confidence that came from never doubting your right to be in a room, from knowing that your presence was valuable regardless of who else was there. And Ethan found himself straightening his shoulders, matching her stride, feeling just a little bit taller than he had 5 minutes ago. They made it 3 steps before someone approached, moving with the kind of speed that suggested urgency masked as casualness. Ethan. It was the woman from earlier, the one with the perfect hair and the cutting smile, but her expression had shifted entirely. The condescension was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like alarm. Her gaze slid to Ava, and recognition hit like lightning. "You're back." "Yeah," Ethan said, keeping his voice neutral. The woman's attention was locked on Ava now, her eyes wider than they'd been before, her smile suddenly uncertain. "I'm sorry, have we met?" Ava extended her hand with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Ava Sterling." The woman's eyes went even wider, her hand reaching out like she was afraid the opportunity might evaporate. "The Ava Sterling?" "Just Ava." Her tone was polite but firm, the kind of voice that didn't invite follow-up questions or assumptions of friendship. Wow." The woman shook Ava's hand like she was greeting royalty, her grip careful and reverent. "I didn't realize you'd be here. Are you a friend of Claire's?" "I'm here with Ethan," Ava said simply, the words falling like stones into still water. The woman blinked, looked at Ethan with new eyes, reassessing, recalculating, looked back at Ava. "Oh, I didn't know you two we worked together," Ethan said quickly, because the assumption in her voice was so loud it practically echoed, because he didn't want Ava to feel obligated to claim a relationship that didn't exist, didn't want to put that pressure on her. "Right, of course." The woman's smile was strained now, pulled tight like a mask that didn't quite fit. "Well, enjoy the evening." She walked away, but Ethan could see her pulling out her phone before she'd even made it 5 feet, her fingers flying across the screen, texting someone, spreading the news. Ethan Cole showed up with Ava Sterling. Can you believe it? That happened a lot? Ava asked quietly, her voice pitched for his ears only. What? People underestimating you. Ethan didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was yes, constantly, every single day. But saying that out loud felt like admitting weakness. They found a table near the edge of the room, the same one Ethan had occupied before, and he helped Mia into a chair. A waiter appeared almost immediately, moving faster than they had earlier, offering champagne with a deference that hadn't been there before. Like Ava's presence had elevated them all somehow. Ava took a glass. Ethan shook his head. Not drinking? Ava asked. Someone has to drive. She nodded, setting her glass down untouched, the champagne going flat and ignored. Then I won't either. It was a small gesture, probably meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but it made Ethan's throat tight, made him look away before she could see whatever expression was on his face. Mia was tired, her head resting on Ethan's arm, but she perked up a little with Ava there, asking questions about school and drawing and what her favorite color was. Ethan stroked her hair absently while scanning the room, watching people watch them. The whispers had spread. He could see it in the way clusters of guests kept glancing over, in the way conversations paused when he made eye contact. They were trying to figure out what Ava Sterling was doing at a wedding with Ethan Cole, trying to make sense of it, trying to reconcile the man they'd dismissed with the woman who commanded respect just by existing. He wanted to tell them it wasn't what it looked like, that Ava was just being kind, that this didn't mean anything beyond a boss looking out for an employee, that they shouldn't read anything into it. But part of him, small, selfish, petty, wanted them to wonder, wanted them to question every assumption they'd made about him, wanted them to lie awake tonight trying to figure out how Ethan Cole had ended up with Ava Sterling at his side. Your ex-wife, Ava said, nodding toward the dance floor where Claire was laughing at something Jonathan had said, her hand on his chest in a gesture of casual intimacy that Ethan remembered from another lifetime. She looks happy. Yeah. And you? Ethan glanced at her, caught off guard by the directness of the question. What about me? Are you happy for her? It was the kind of question most people asked without expecting a real answer. The kind where you were supposed to say yes, of course, absolutely. Because anything else made you look bitter or small. But Ava's gaze was steady, genuinely curious, and Ethan found himself actually considering it instead of just deflecting. I don't know, he admitted, the honesty feeling dangerous. I want to be. I mean, she deserves to be happy. We didn't work out, and that's fine. It happens. People grow apart. People want different things. He paused, trying to find the right words. But being here, watching her with him, it's like you're being erased, Ava finished, her voice soft. Ethan looked at her, startled by how precisely she'd named the feeling. Yeah, exactly. Ava was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant, focused on something only she could see. I know that feeling. You do? She smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. I built a company from nothing. Spent 15 years proving I belonged in rooms where people told me I didn't, where men twice my age with half my experience talked over me, dismissed my ideas, suggested I'd be better suited to taking notes than taking meetings. She met his eyes. And even now, there are days when someone looks at me and sees a fluke, a lucky break, an exception that proves the rule. Like I'm not really supposed to be here, like any minute someone's going to realize the mistake and take it all away. She paused. So, yeah, I know what it's like to feel erased. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He'd always thought of Ava as untouchable, someone who'd figured it all out, who'd never doubted herself, who moved through the world with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. It had never occurred to him that she might have felt the way he did, that success didn't automatically erase those feelings. For what it's worth, Ava said, her voice stronger now, you're not a fluke. You're one of the best assistants I've ever had. And I've had a lot. Thanks, Ethan said, and meant it with a depth that surprised him. Before Ava could respond, someone else approached the table. This time it was a man in his 60s, silver-haired, expensive watch glinting on his wrist like a small sun. Ethan recognized him vaguely. One of Claire's uncles, maybe, or a family friend who'd been at the house for holidays back when Ethan was still part of that world. Ava Sterling, the man said, his voice booming with the kind of confidence that came from never being told to quiet down. I thought that was you. Ava stood, shaking his hand with practiced professionalism. Mr. Brennan. Call me George. He glanced at Ethan, then back at Ava, his eyebrows rising with poorly concealed surprise. I didn't know you knew Claire. I don't, Ava said smoothly, her tone leaving no room for follow-up questions. I'm here with Ethan. George's eyebrows shot up further, threatening to disappear into his hairline. Ethan? Really? There was something in his tone, disbelief maybe, or amusement, or that particular brand of condescension that came from people who couldn't imagine someone like Ava choosing to be anywhere with someone like Ethan. And Ethan felt his jaw tighten, felt his hands clench under the table where no one could see. Really, Ava said, her voice cooling by several degrees. George seemed to realize he'd stepped on something, that the temperature of the conversation had shifted in a way that put him on dangerous ground. Well, that's great. Ethan's a good guy. Known him for years. That was a lie. George had met Ethan exactly once, at a family barbecue 5 years ago, and had spent the entire time talking over him, redirecting conversations away from him, treating him like furniture that happened to be capable of speech. He is, Ava agreed, and there was steel in her voice now. George lingered for another moment, clearly trying to figure out what was happening, what it meant, whether there was an advantage to be gained or a connection to be made. Then he excused himself with a vague promise to catch up later, disappearing back into the crowd. As soon as he was gone, Ava sat back down, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. Friend of yours? Claire's uncle, Ethan said. He doesn't like me. His loss. Ethan almost smiled. The evening wore on, minutes stretching like taffy. More people stopped by the table, some to greet Ava, some to gawk, some to reassess Ethan now that he was sitting beside someone who mattered, someone whose opinion carried weight. Each time, Ava handled them with the same calm professionalism, never letting the conversation linger too long, never giving them more than they deserved, never allowing them to make her presence about them instead of about Ethan. And each time, Ethan felt a little less invisible, a little more solid, like he was becoming real in a room that had spent hours treating him like a ghost. Daddy. Mia tugged on his sleeve, her voice drowsy, words slurring slightly with exhaustion. Can we go home soon? Yeah, sweetheart, soon. Ava glanced at her watch, a delicate thing that probably cost more than Ethan's car. It's late. If you want to leave, I can walk out with you. You don't have to. I know. She stood, smoothing her dress with practiced movements. But I'm ready to go too. These things get old fast. Ethan wondered if that was true or if she was just being kind. Either way, he was grateful. They were halfway to the exit when Claire appeared, materializing out of the crowd like she'd been watching for them, waiting for her moment. Ethan! Her voice was sharp, cutting through the ambient noise of conversation and music. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes, didn't soften the line of her jaw. Leaving already? Mia's tired, Ethan said, keeping his voice even. Claire's gaze shifted to Ava, and her smile tightened, became something brittle. I don't think we've been introduced. Ava Sterling. Ava extended her hand and Claire shook it, her grip just a fraction too firm, holding on just a moment too long. I've heard of you, Claire said, and her tone suggested the hearing hadn't been entirely positive. You run that tech company, right? I do. Impressive. Claire's tone suggested it was anything but. Suggested that running a tech company was somehow less legitimate than whatever Claire did, though Ethan couldn't remember anymore. Something in marketing, maybe. Or consulting. One of those jobs that sounded important but was hard to explain. She looked at Ethan, her smile showing teeth now. I didn't know you were bringing someone. I wasn't, Ethan said, because it was the truth. Ava came separately. How convenient. Claire's smile was all teeth now, sharp enough to draw blood. Well, I'm glad you could make it, both of you. There was an awkward pause, the kind that stretched too long and made everyone uncomfortable, made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Ethan could feel Mia pressing closer to his leg, could feel her picking up on the tension even if she didn't understand it. Then Ava spoke, her voice smooth and professional and absolutely final. "Congratulations on your marriage, Claire. You and Jonathan make a lovely couple." It was polite. Gracious, even. The kind of thing you were supposed to say at weddings. But there was something underneath it. Something that made Claire's smile falter, made her eyes narrow just slightly, made her reassess whatever game she'd been trying to play. "Thank you," Claire said stiffly, the words forced through a throat that clearly wanted to say something else entirely. She turned and walked away, her posture rigid, her train dragging behind her like she was trying to gather dignity around herself like a cloak. "She doesn't like you," Ava observed, her tone clinically neutral. "She doesn't like that you're here with me," Ethan corrected, because that was the truth of it. Claire could handle Ethan being alone, being small, being exactly what she'd expected when she'd sent that invitation. She couldn't handle him showing up with someone like Ava. Ava glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. "Does that bother you?" "No." And to his surprise, it didn't. For the first time all night, Ethan felt something other than shame. He felt vindicated, maybe, or just less alone. Like maybe he wasn't the failure everyone had decided he was. They made it outside, and the cold air hit Ethan like a slap, sharp and bracing after the warmth of the reception hall. Mia was practically asleep on her feet, swaying slightly, and he scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. She made a small sound of contentment and buried her face in his shoulder. "Thank you," he said to Ava, the words inadequate for what he was feeling. "For coming. For everything." Ava's expression softened, her professional mask slipping to reveal something more human underneath. "You don't have to thank me, Ethan." "I do, though. You didn't have to do this. You could have spent your Saturday doing anything else, and instead you drove across town to rescue me from my own humiliation." "Maybe I didn't do it for you," Ava said, and there was something in her voice that made Ethan look at her more closely. "Maybe I did it for me." "What do you mean?" She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. "You've been working for me for 3 years, and in all that time, you've never asked for anything. Not once. You show up early, stay late, handle everything I throw at you without complaining. You make my life easier in 100 small ways every single day, and you do it so quietly that most people don't even notice." She paused. "But I notice. And tonight, watching you walk back in there, knowing how hard it must have been..." She stopped, shook her head. "You deserve to have someone in your corner, that's all." Ethan's throat was tight. He wanted to say something, to tell her what it meant, but the words wouldn't come. Couldn't come. Because if he started talking, he might not stop, might say things that would make Monday morning awkward, might cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Ava seemed to understand. She smiled, stepping back toward her car. "Drive safe, Ethan." "You too." She walked away, and Ethan watched her go, Mia warm and heavy in his arms, feeling like something fundamental had shifted but not quite able to name what. Then he turned and carried his daughter to their sedan, the night settling around them like a blanket, soft and dark and full of possibility. The drive home was quiet. Mia fell asleep within minutes, her head lolling against the booster seat, small snores filling the car. Ethan drove on autopilot, his mind replaying the evening in fragments, the way people had stared when he walked in with Ava, the way Claire's smile had cracked, the way Ava had stood beside him, calm and unbothered, like being there was the most natural thing in the world, like he deserved to have someone like her in his corner. By the time he pulled into the driveway of their small house, Ethan felt like he'd run a marathon, exhausted, drained, but also lighter somehow, like something he'd been carrying for years had been set down, even if just temporarily. He carried Mia inside, navigating the familiar path through the living room to her bedroom, tucking her into bed without waking her. She stirred once, mumbling something he couldn't make out, probably something about dancing or ice cream or one of the 1,000 small joys that filled her world, and he kissed her forehead before turning off the light. Then he went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the table in the dark, letting the silence wash over him. His phone buzzed, vibrating against the wooden table loud enough to make him jump. He pulled it out, expecting a work email or spam. Instead, it was a text from Ava. "You did good tonight. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Ethan stared at the screen, his chest tight, his eyes burning with something that might have been tears if he let it be. He typed out a response, deleted it, typed it again, deleted it again. Finally settled on something simple. Thank you for everything. Her reply came almost immediately, like she'd been waiting. Anytime. Ethan set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows from the streetlight outside play across the plaster. For the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as small as he'd thought, wasn't as alone, wasn't as hopeless. The feeling wouldn't last. He knew that. Monday would come, and with it all the usual pressures, all the bills that needed paying and problems that needed solving, and moments when he'd wonder if he was doing any of this right. But for now, sitting in his kitchen in the dark with his daughter asleep down the hall and Ava's words still glowing on his phone screen, Ethan let himself believe that things might actually be okay, that he might actually be okay. The next morning arrived too early, sunlight streaming through cheap curtains that didn't quite block it out. Ethan woke to the sound of Mia singing in the kitchen, her voice high and slightly off-key, singing something she'd learned at school about weather or seasons or friendship. He dragged himself out of bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes because he'd been too tired to change, and found her standing on a stool, trying to reach the cereal on the top shelf, her small arms stretched as far as they'd go. "Morning, sweetheart." She turned, grinning with the uncomplicated joy of a 7-year-old who'd slept well and woken up happy. "Morning, Daddy. Can we have pancakes?" "Sure." He lifted her down, grabbing the cereal box she'd been reaching for. "How'd you sleep?" "Good." She hopped onto a chair, swinging her legs with excess energy. "I liked Miss Sterling. She's nice." "Yeah, she is." "Is she your friend?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer that. "She's my boss." "Can she be both?" He didn't have an answer for that. Wasn't sure what the rules were, what the boundaries should be, whether what happened last night changed anything or meant anything, or was just a kind gesture from someone who'd felt sorry for him. They spent the morning in their usual routine, pancakes that Ethan burned slightly because he was distracted, cartoons that Mia narrated even though she'd seen them a dozen times, a trip to the park where she chased pigeons while Ethan sat on a bench with his phone in his hand. He wanted to text Ava again. Wanted to say something more than thank you, wanted to acknowledge what she'd done in a way that felt adequate. But every message he drafted seemed wrong, too formal, too casual, too presumptuous, too distant. He put the phone away and watched his daughter play, trying to be present, trying to appreciate this moment instead of worrying about the next one. By Monday, the wedding felt like a distant memory, something that had happened to someone else. Ethan showed up to work at 7, coffee in hand, ready to dive into Ava's schedule. She had back-to-back meetings all day. Investors, board members, a lunch with someone from a venture capital firm that Ethan had spent Friday coordinating down to the minute. He moved through the tasks with the efficiency he'd perfected over 3 years, anticipating needs before they arose, solving problems before they became crises, making himself indispensable in the way that had kept him employed when so many others hadn't. He didn't see Ava until late afternoon when she called him into her office, her voice through the intercom neutral and professional. "Close the door," she said when he entered. He did, his stomach nodding. This was it. She was going to tell him that Saturday had been a mistake, that they needed to maintain professional boundaries, that what happened couldn't happen again. Ava gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit." He sat, his hands clenched in his lap, preparing himself for rejection disguised as professional courtesy. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, her fingers steepled in front of her face. Then she said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About Saturday night." She paused. "About how hard you work, how much you handle, and how little I've acknowledged it." "Ava, you don't have to. Let me finish." Her tone was gentle but firm, the same voice she used in board meetings when someone tried to interrupt her. "You've been with me for 3 years, Ethan. You've never missed a deadline, never complained, never asked for anything beyond your salary. You make my job possible. You make my life manageable. And I've taken that for granted." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "I want to change that." "What do you mean?" "I'm giving you a raise, 20%, effective immediately." Ethan stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "What?" "You heard me." "Ava, You don't have to do that. I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because you've earned it. She met his eyes, her expression serious. You're worth more than I've been paying you, significantly more, and it's time I recognize that. Ethan's throat was tight. He wanted to argue, to tell her it wasn't necessary, but the truth was, he needed it, had needed it for months, for years. The raise would mean he could stop checking his bank account before buying groceries, could fix the dent in his car, could take Mia to do something fun without calculating whether they could afford it. Thank you, he said quietly, the words completely inadequate. Ava nodded, but she wasn't done. There's one more thing. What? I'm promoting you, Chief of Staff. Ethan blinked, certain now that he was hallucinating, that the stress of the weekend had finally broken something in his brain. Ava, I'm a personal assistant. You're more than that. She leaned forward, her gaze intense, burning with certainty. You manage my schedule, coordinate my meetings, handle crises I don't even know about because you solve them before they reach me. You're already doing the job. I'm just giving you the title that matches the work. I don't... Ethan stopped, unsure what to say. Why now? Because Saturday night reminded me of something, Ava said, her voice softer now. People underestimate you, and I've been part of that problem. I've let you stay in the background, let you be invisible, because it was convenient, because you were so good at it that I didn't have to think about it. She paused. But you're not invisible, Ethan. You shouldn't be treated like you are. You deserve recognition. You deserve respect. And if I have to force people to give it to you by changing your title, then that's what I'll do. Ethan didn't trust himself to speak. His throat was too tight, his eyes burning with something he refused to name. Ava stood, extending her hand across the desk. So, do you accept? He stood too, his legs unsteady, and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, warm, real. Yeah, I accept. Her smile was genuine, reaching her eyes, transforming her face. Good. Now get back to work. You've got a staff meeting to plan. Can't have my chief of staff slacking off on his first day. Ethan left her office in a daze, his mind spinning, trying to process what had just happened. A raise, a promotion, a title that meant something, that came with respect and authority and the kind of visibility he'd spent years avoiding. It wasn't a fix. It didn't erase the years of struggle, the nights he'd stayed up worrying about rent, the moments he'd felt like he was drowning with no one to throw him a rope. It didn't undo Claire's wedding or the whispers or the feeling of being small in a room full of people who'd made it clear he didn't belong. But it was a start. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan felt like maybe, just maybe, things were starting to turn around. The news spread faster than Ethan expected, faster than seemed possible in an office of only 40 people, but that was the nature of workplaces. Information moved like wildfire, fueled by curiosity and the human need to make sense of change. By Tuesday afternoon, half the office knew about his promotion. He could see it in the way people looked at him differently in the hallway, in the slight pause before they spoke, in the recalibration happening behind their eyes. By Wednesday, people he'd never spoken to beyond polite nods were congratulating him, their smiles genuine or envious or confused depending on their position in the company hierarchy. By Thursday, he was sitting in meetings he'd previously only scheduled, contributing ideas instead of just taking notes, his voice carrying weight it had never carried before. It was disorienting, like waking up in someone else's life, someone else's body, someone who people actually listened to when they spoke. Ethan, what do you think? He looked up, blinking. The conference room had gone quiet, all eyes on him. 8 people around the table, including Ava at the head, and they were all waiting for him to have an opinion that mattered, that would influence decisions, that would shape the direction of a company worth millions. Ava sat at the head of the table, waiting patiently, her expression neutral, but her eyes encouraging. She just asked him a question he hadn't fully heard because he'd been too busy panicking internally about being in this room at all. Sorry, could you repeat that? The investor meeting next week, Ava said, her voice patient like she had all the time in the world. Do we lead with the product roadmap or the revenue projections? Ethan's mind raced, pulling together 3 years of coordinating these meetings, of watching them unfold from the sidelines, of understanding the rhythm and psychology even when he wasn't part of the actual discussion. He knew these investors, had scheduled calls with them, sent them materials, listened to enough of their conversations to understand what motivated them. Roadmap first, he said, his voice stronger than he felt. They're already sold on the numbers. They've seen the quarterly reports. They know we're profitable. What they want is vision. They want to know where we're going, not just where we've been. Lead with the future, then back it up with the data that proves we can get there. Ava smiled, and it was the kind of smile that felt like approval, like validation, like maybe he'd just passed a test he hadn't known he was taking. Agreed. She turned to the VP of Finance, a man in his 50s who'd been with the company since the beginning. Make sure the deck reflects that. Roadmap first, revenue supporting. The meeting continued, flowing around him like water around a stone, and Ethan felt a small surge of something he couldn't quite name. Confidence, maybe. Or just the absence of the crushing certainty that he was about to be exposed as a fraud. When it ended, people filed out and Ava caught his arm as he was leaving, her touch brief but deliberate. Good call in there, she said quietly. Thanks. You settling in okay? Yeah, I think so. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It's just different. Different how? People listen to me now. They didn't before. Ava's expression darkened slightly, a shadow crossing her face. They should have been listening all along. That's on them, not you. Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the anger he saw in her eyes, anger on his behalf that felt foreign and overwhelming. Maybe, but they weren't. Well, they are now. Get used to it. She released his arm, already turning toward her next meeting, her next crisis, her next decision. Also, clear your evening. We need to prep for the investor meeting, and I want your input on the presentation. I have to pick up Mia up. Bring her. We'll order pizza. Make it work. I mean it, Ethan. I need you on this. She walked away before he could argue, leaving him standing in the hallway with the strange realization that he was needed, that his presence mattered, that he wasn't just a cog in someone else's machine anymore. That evening, Ethan picked Mia up from after-school care, and she launched into a breathless recap of her day before he'd even buckled her in, words tumbling over each other in the way they did when she was excited and had too much to say. And then Mrs. Patterson said my drawing was the best one, and she put it on the wall, and everyone said it was really good, and Tommy said he wished he could draw like me, and, Daddy, are you listening? I'm listening. He smiled, pulling out of the parking lot, watching her in the rearview mirror as she bounced in her booster seat. Your drawing got put on the wall. That's great, sweetheart. Can we celebrate? How do you want to celebrate? Ice cream? Ethan glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was already past 6, and he still had emails to answer, a presentation to review for tomorrow, and now this evening session with Ava that he'd just agreed to. But Mia was looking at him with those wide, hopeful eyes, and he found himself nodding before his practical brain could overrule his heart. Yeah, let's get ice cream. They ended up at a small shop near their house, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu written in colored chalk that was probably meant to look artisanal but just looked cheap. Mia ordered chocolate with sprinkles, eyes wide as she watched the scoops pile higher than seemed structurally sound. Ethan got vanilla because it was cheap and he wasn't really hungry anyway. His stomach still knotted from the day's meetings. They sat by the window and Mia swung her legs, licking her cone with the kind of intense focus that made Ethan's chest ache. She was so small, so easily pleased, and he'd spent the last 5 years terrified he wasn't giving her enough, that she was missing out, that his failure as a husband would somehow translate into failure as a father. Daddy, why are you staring at me? I'm not staring. I'm looking. That's the same thing. It's different. He took a bite of his ice cream, the cold making his teeth ache. I'm just happy. Because of ice cream? Because of you. Mia giggled, chocolate smeared on her upper lip, and Ethan felt the knot in his chest loosen a little. His phone buzzed on the table between them, vibrating loud enough to make Mia look down at it. You should check that, she said, sounding far too adult for a 7-year-old, like she'd been listening to him say the same thing too many times. Ethan pulled out his phone, 2 texts from Ava. Investor confirmed for Monday. Need you to prep the conference room. Also, dinner tomorrow night? My treat. We should celebrate your promotion properly. Ethan stared at the second message, reading it 3 times to make sure he understood. Dinner. With Ava. Just the two of them. Was that normal? Did bosses do that? Or was this something else? Something he shouldn't read too much into but couldn't help analyzing because nothing in his life had prepared him for this kind of attention from someone like her. He typed out a response, his thumbs hesitant. You don't have to do that. Her reply came immediately, like she'd been waiting, phone in hand. I know, but I want to. 7 p.m. Marcello's. Don't argue. Marcello's. He knew that place. Had driven past it 100 times, looked at the prices on the menu posted outside, and kept walking because a single entree cost more than he spent on groceries for a week. Ethan hesitated, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Every instinct told him to decline, to maintain boundaries, to not blur lines that were already feeling dangerously blurred. But another part of him, smaller, braver, more hopeful, wanted to say yes. Wanted to see what happened when he stopped protecting himself from possibilities. Okay, he typed finally. He put the phone away, and when he looked up, Mia was watching him with that unnerving perceptiveness that children had, the ability to see through adult pretenses. Who was that? Miss Sterling. Is she nice to you at work? Yeah, she's really nice. Good. Mia nodded seriously, like she was evaluating his life and finding it acceptable. You should have nice people around you. Ethan didn't know how to respond to that, so he just reached over and ruffled her hair, earning an indignant squeal and a grin. Friday dragged in the way days did when you were dreading something and looking forward to it in equal measure. Ethan spent most of it preparing for the investor meeting, coordinating schedules, making sure every detail was locked down. Room temperature, refreshments, the right adapter for the projector because last time someone had forgotten and they'd wasted 15 minutes scrambling. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, his eyes were burning from staring at spreadsheets, his shoulders tight with tension he couldn't quite shake. He was packing up when Ava appeared in his doorway, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed. You're still here. Just finishing up? It's Friday night. Go home. I will. In a minute. Ava stepped into his office, closing the door behind her with a soft click that seemed to amplify in the sudden quiet. You know you don't have to prove anything, right? Ethan looked up from his laptop. What do you mean? I promoted you because you earned it, not because I expected you to work yourself into the ground, trying to justify my decision. I'm not. You are. Her tone was gentle but firm, the same voice she used when she was right and knew it. I've seen you, Ethan. You're always the first one here, the last to leave. You skip lunch half the time. When's the last time you took a day off? Ethan couldn't remember. Literally couldn't remember the last time he'd called in sick, or taken a personal day, or done anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Exactly. Ava straightened. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to close that laptop, go home, and spend the evening with Mia. And tomorrow, you're taking the day off. Ava, I can't. It's not a request, it's an order. She smiled, but there was steel underneath it. See you tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Don't be late. She left before he could argue, and Ethan sat there for a moment, staring at the closed door, before closing his laptop with more force than necessary. Saturday was strange in the way unscheduled time always was for Ethan. Unsettling, almost anxiety-inducing. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a full day with nothing to do, no emails to answer, no schedules to coordinate, no fires to put out. Just time. Empty, unstructured, his to fill however he wanted. He and Mia spent the morning at the park, the same one they always went to, with the rusty swings and the sandbox that probably needed to be condemned, but somehow never was. Then they came home and built a blanket fort in the living room, using every pillow in the house and dining room chairs that wouldn't quite stay in place. They watched cartoons, ate grilled cheese for lunch that Ethan burned slightly because he was distracted, and when Mia asked if they could bake cookies, Ethan said yes, even though the kitchen was already a disaster, and he hated baking with a passion that bordered on irrational. By the time 5 o'clock rolled around, the house smelled like burnt sugar and vanilla. Mia's hands were covered in flour up to her elbows, and Ethan felt more relaxed than he had in months, maybe years. Okay, sweetheart, I need to get ready for dinner. Mia looked up from the cookies she was arranging on a plate with intense concentration. each one needing to be in exactly the right position. Where are you going? Out with Miss Sterling. Is it a date? Ethan nearly choked on air. What? No, it's work. But you're going to dinner. Yeah, but that doesn't make it a date. Mia shrugged, unconvinced, already losing interest in the conversation and returning to her cookies. Okay. Ethan's neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, agreed to watch Mia for the evening. She was a retired teacher who lived 2 doors down and had babysat more times than Ethan could count, always refusing payment no matter how much he insisted, which made him feel guilty but also desperately grateful because he genuinely couldn't afford a regular babysitter. By 6:30, Ethan was standing in front of his closet, staring at his limited options with the kind of despair usually reserved for much bigger problems. He didn't own a lot of nice clothes. Most of his wardrobe was work attire, button-downs in various shades of blue and white, slacks that were starting to show wear at the knees, the occasional blazer for important meetings. Nothing that felt right for dinner at Marcello's, which he'd looked up online and immediately regretted because the place had cloth napkins and a wine list and reviews that used words like exquisite and refined. He settled on a dark blue shirt and his best pair of pants, the ones without a stain on the knee or a loose thread at the hem. He combed his hair, checked his reflection in the bathroom mirror that was starting to show spots of oxidation, and told himself this was fine. Just dinner. Just 2 colleagues celebrating a promotion. Not a date. Definitely not a date. He arrived at Marcello's at 6:55, parking his dented sedan in a lot full of cars that cost more than he'd make in 5 years, and took a deep breath that didn't calm him the way he'd hoped. The restaurant was nicer than he'd expected, which was saying something because he'd expected it to be nice. Dim lighting that was romantic without being dark. Soft music playing, something classical that Ethan didn't recognize but that sounded expensive. Tables spaced far enough apart that conversations felt private, intimate. A hostess greeted him at the door with a smile that was professional and warm in equal measure. "Reservation for Sterling," he said, and watched her expression shift slightly, recognition and something like respect. She led him through the dining room, past couples leaning close over wine glasses, past groups laughing over shared plates, past people who belonged in places like this in ways Ethan never would. Ava was already there, seated at a corner table with a glass of wine in front of her. She looked different. Not the polished, professional version he saw at work, all sharp suits and tighter buns. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders in waves that caught the light. She wore a simple black dress, minimal jewelry, and when she smiled at him, Ethan felt something in his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with anxiety. "You're early," she said. "So are you." "Habit." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." He sat, feeling awkward in a way he hadn't since high school, when every social interaction felt like a test he didn't know how to pass. A waiter appeared immediately, offering a menu and asking about drinks. Ethan ordered water. The waiter looked faintly disappointed, like Ethan had somehow failed at being a customer. "You can get wine if you want," Ava said once the waiter had left. "I'm driving." "Fair enough." She pushed her own wine glass away, barely touched. "Then I won't either." It was a small gesture, probably meaningless, but it made Ethan's throat tight in a way he didn't want to examine too closely. They sat in silence for a moment, and Ethan realized he had no idea how to do this. How to have dinner with someone who wasn't his daughter. How to make conversation that didn't revolve around schedules and meetings and work. How to be a person instead of just an employee. "Relax," Ava said, reading him like he was an open book with large print. "You look like you're about to be interrogated." "Sorry, I don't do this a lot." "Do what? Eat?" "Go out. To places like this." Ava's expression softened, something shifting in her eyes. "When's the last time you went to dinner somewhere that wasn't a chain restaurant?" Ethan thought about it, actually tried to remember, scrolling back through years of rushed meals and drive-thrus, and pasta cooked at midnight after Mia was asleep. "I don't know, 5 years maybe? Before Mia was born? Before everything fell apart." "That's a long time." "Yeah, well, priorities." The waiter returned and they ordered. Ava got some kind of pasta dish Ethan couldn't pronounce even after hearing her say it twice. He went with chicken because it was the safest option on a menu full of things he'd never heard of, ingredients he couldn't identify. When the waiter left, Ava leaned back in her chair, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you stay? Stay where? With me. With the company. You've had offers, I know you have. I've seen the emails. She paused, her gaze never wavering. So why didn't you leave? Ethan blinked. You read my emails? Only the subject lines, but headhunters aren't subtle. She took a sip of water, her fingers elegant around the glass. So why didn't you leave? He didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't want to say it out loud because it made him sound pathetic, desperate, like someone who couldn't do better, so he settled for what he had. I guess I didn't think anyone else would take a chance on me, he said finally, the words tasting like admission of failure. That's not true. Maybe, but it felt true. He looked down at his hands, at the calluses on his palms from carrying Mia, from fixing things in their house that kept breaking, from living a life that required constant manual effort. You were the first person in a long time who didn't make me feel like I had to apologize for existing. Ava was quiet for a moment, so quiet that Ethan looked up to see if he'd said something wrong, crossed some line he hadn't known was there. That's a low bar, Ethan, she said finally, her voice soft. I know, but it's the one I had. The food arrived and they ate in companionable silence for a while. The chicken was good, better than good, cooked perfectly, seasoned in ways that made Ethan realize how bland his own cooking had become, how he'd optimized for speed and cost instead of flavor. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a meal he hadn't cooked himself or pulled from a drive-through bag. How's Mia doing? Ava asked after a while, her tone casual but her interest genuine. She's good. Great, actually. She got one of her drawings put up in class this week. That's wonderful. What did she draw? A house, with a garden and a dog. Ethan smiled despite himself. We don't have a dog. Does she want one? She wants everything. Last week it was a dog. The week before, a trampoline. This week she's been asking about piano lessons. He shook his head, affection mixing with the ever-present anxiety about money. I'm running out of ways to say maybe someday. Ava laughed, and the sound was so unexpected, so genuine, that Ethan found himself laughing too, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. She sounds like a great kid, Ava said. She is. She's the best thing I've ever done. The only thing I'm absolutely sure I didn't mess up. You're a good father, Ethan. Ethan looked up, startled by the certainty in her voice. How do you know? Because I see the way you talk about her, the way you prioritize her, even when it costs you, the way you show up for her every single day without fail. Ava set down her fork, her expression serious. That's not something you can fake. That's not something everyone does, even when they should. She paused, something crossing her face, memory, maybe, or old pain. My father was never around. He was always working, always chasing the next deal, the next acquisition. I barely knew him growing up. And when he died, I realized I didn't really know him at all. Just the image he projected, the success story, the man everyone else saw. She met Ethan's eyes. Mia won't have that problem. She knows you, really knows you. And that matters more than anything else you could give her. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. The weight of her words settled over him, heavy and warm and uncomfortable in the way truth often was. Thank you, he said quietly, inadequately. They finished dinner, the conversation flowing easier now, touching on everything and nothing, movies they'd seen, books they'd read, the absurdity of some of their board members, the way the city had changed over the past decade. Ethan found himself relaxing in a way he couldn't remember doing in years, his guard dropping bit by bit until he was just himself. Not an employee, not a struggling single father, just Ethan, talking to someone who seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say. The waiter brought the check and Ava grabbed it before Ethan could even reach for his wallet, which was good because he'd already mentally calculated that the meal cost more than he spent on food in 2 weeks. I said it was my treat. You don't have to… Ethan. Her tone was firm, brooking no argument. Let me do this, please. He nodded, swallowing whatever pride or protest he'd been about to voice, and she handed the waiter her card without even looking at the total. They walked out together, and the night air was cool, crisp, carrying the first hint of autumn. Ethan's car was parked at the far end of the lot, and Ava walked with him, her heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. "Thank you for tonight," Ethan said when they reached his car, the words feeling inadequate for what he was feeling. "I needed this. Needed to remember what it feels like to be, I don't know, normal, I guess." "So did I," Ava said, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her more closely. "You did?" "Yeah. I spend most of my time in boardrooms and investor meetings. It's easy to forget what it's like to just talk, to have a conversation that isn't about quarterly projections or market share or who's trying to undermine me this week." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "So thank you for reminding me why I started this company in the first place. It wasn't about the money or the success. It was about building something that mattered, with people who mattered." She paused. "You matter, Ethan. I hope you know that." Ethan's throat was tight, his eyes burning. He wanted to say something, to tell her what that meant, but the words stuck somewhere between his chest and his mouth. Ava seemed to understand. She stepped closer, and for a moment Ethan thought she might hug him. Instead, she just touched his arm, briefly, her hand warm even through his shirt. "Drive safe," she said. Then she turned and walked to her car, leaving Ethan standing there in the parking lot, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with possibility. The drive home felt different somehow, like the city had rearranged itself while he was inside the restaurant, familiar streets taking on new significance. Ethan replayed the evening in his mind, trying to capture the feeling of it before it slipped away. The way Ava had looked at him across the table, the easy flow of conversation, the moment her hand had touched his arm and lingered just a second longer than necessary. He told himself not to read too much into it. She was his boss. This was professional courtesy. Successful people took their employees out to celebrate promotions all the time. It didn't mean anything beyond what it obviously meant. But his heart wasn't listening to his brain, and the warmth in his chest suggested that maybe, just maybe, something had shifted. When he got home, Mrs. Alvarez was sitting on the couch watching a cooking show with the volume low. Mia was asleep in her room, sprawled across the bed in the boneless way only children could manage. "How was she?" Ethan asked quietly. "An angel, as always." Mrs. Alvarez stood, gathering her cardigan. "We made more cookies. I hope you don't mind." "Not at all. Thank you for watching her." "It's never a problem, mijo. You know that." She paused at the door, studying him with eyes that had seen too much of life to miss the obvious. "You look happy. It's good to see." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that, so he just smiled and watched her walk the short distance to her own house, waiting until she was safely inside before closing his door. He checked on Mia, pulling her blanket up over her shoulders, brushing hair away from her face. She stirred slightly, mumbling something about cookies and rainbows, and Ethan felt his chest constrict with love so fierce it almost hurt. Everything he did, every choice he made, every risk he took, it all came back to the small person who trusted him completely, who believed he could do anything, who didn't know yet how close they'd come to falling apart so many times. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the table in the dark, his phone in his hand. No messages. He hadn't expected any, but part of him had hoped. The weekend passed in the familiar rhythm of single parenthood, laundry, grocery shopping, a trip to the library where Mia checked out 6 books even though she could only read 2 of them. They went to the park again on Sunday, and Ethan pushed her on the swings until his arms ached, her laughter carrying across the playground like music. For a few hours, he forgot about work, about Ava, about everything except this moment with his daughter under a sky so blue it looked painted. But Monday came, the way it always did, relentless and unavoidable. Ethan arrived at the office at 7, the building still mostly empty except for the security guard and a few people from the engineering team who seemed to live there. He made coffee in the small kitchen, checked his email, started working through the logistics for the investor meeting that was now just hours away. The conference room needed to be set up. The presentation needed final tweaks. Refreshments needed to be ordered. 100 small details that would make or break the meeting, that would either position Ava as competent and prepared or disorganized and amateur. He was deep in the work when his phone rang. Claire's name flashed on the screen. Ethan stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to answer. They hadn't spoken since the wedding, hadn't exchanged more than brief texts about Mia's schedule. There was no reason for her to be calling at 7 in the morning on a Monday unless something was wrong. He answered, "Hello? Ethan, it's Claire." Her voice was tight, controlled in the way it got when she was trying not to show emotion. "I'm sorry to call so early." "It's fine. What's up? Is Mia okay?" "Mia's fine. This isn't about her." A pause. "I wanted to talk to you. About the wedding." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What about it?" "I heard—" She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "I heard you got a promotion. Chief of Staff. That's impressive." "Thanks. And I saw pictures of you and Ava Sterling." Her voice had an edge now, sharp enough to cut. "People are talking, Ethan. Everyone's talking about how you showed up with her, about what that means." Ethan felt anger rise in his chest, hot and sudden. "What does it mean, Claire?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking. We worked together. She came to support me. That's all." Even as he said it, he wondered if it was true, if it really was that simple. "Right. Of course." Claire's tone suggested she didn't believe him, didn't believe it could possibly be that innocent. "Well, congratulations. On the promotion. You've clearly done well for yourself." There was something in the way she said it, like she was surprised, like she'd expected him to stay exactly where he'd been when she left, struggling, barely managing, always one crisis away from collapse. "I'm trying," Ethan said quietly. "I can see that." Another pause, longer this time. "I also wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way things went at the wedding. Jonathan said some people were unkind to you. I should have said something. I should have stood up for you." Ethan didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to tell her it was fine, that it didn't matter, that he'd moved past it. But it did matter. It had mattered. "Yeah," he said finally. "You should have." Claire was quiet, and in that silence, Ethan could hear all the things they'd never said to each other, all the ways they'd failed each other, all the damage that couldn't be undone. "But I appreciate you saying that," Ethan added, because he wasn't cruel, because holding on to anger felt like carrying rocks for no reason. "I hope you're happy, Claire. I mean that." "I am," she said softly. "I hope you are too." "I'm getting there." They hung up, and Ethan sat there for a moment, staring at his phone, feeling like he'd just closed a door that had been stuck open for years. By the time 9 o'clock rolled around, the office was filling up, people arriving with coffee and complaints about traffic. Ethan had the conference room set up perfectly, presentation loaded and tested, refreshments arranged, temperature adjusted to exactly 72 degrees because one of the investors always complained when it was too warm. The investors arrived at 10. 3 men in expensive suits who looked at Ethan with the kind of polite disinterest reserved for people they considered beneath notice. But when Ava introduced him as her chief of staff, something shifted in their expressions. Not respect exactly, but recognition that he might matter, that he might be worth paying attention to. The meeting went better than Ethan expected. Ava led with the roadmap exactly as he'd suggested, painting a vision of the future that was ambitious but grounded in data. When they pushed back on timelines, Ethan stepped in with supporting information, answering questions about logistics and coordination that Ava couldn't have known off the top of her head. He watched the investors' expressions change as he spoke, watched them reassess, recalculate, realized that maybe Ethan Cole wasn't just some assistant who fetched coffee. When the presentation ended and the lead investor leaned back in his chair with a satisfied nod, Ethan felt something close to pride. "Well done," Ava said afterward, once the conference room had cleared and it was just the two of them. "You handled their questions perfectly. I just stuck to what I knew. There is no script for that kind of interrogation. You improvised, and you were excellent." She gathered her notes, organizing them with the precise movements she used when she was pleased but trying not to show it. "I'm serious, Ethan. You're a natural at this. I made the right choice promoting you." He wanted to believe her. A larger part of him did now than would have a month ago. But there was still that voice in the back of his head whispering that he'd gotten lucky, that next time he'd mess up, that he was one mistake away from proving everyone right about him. "Thanks," he said, because that was safer than admitting doubt. The rest of the week unfolded in a rhythm Ethan was starting to recognize. Early mornings reviewing schedules, back-to-back meetings where his input actually mattered, late nights making sure nothing fell through the cracks. Somewhere in the middle of it all, he squeezed in parent-teacher conferences where Mia's teacher told him she was excelling, grocery shopping where he didn't have to check prices quite as carefully, helping Mia with homework that seemed designed to confuse parents more than educate children. By Friday, he was exhausted in a way that felt earned rather than defeating, tired from actual accomplishment rather than just survival. "You look terrible," Ava said when she found him in the break room pouring his fifth cup of coffee. "Thanks. You really know how to make a guy feel good." She smiled. "I'm serious. When's the last time you slept more than 5 hours?" Ethan shrugged. "Sleep's overrated." "It's really not." Ava leaned against the counter, her expression shifting from teasing to concerned. "You know you don't have to do everything yourself anymore, right? You have a team now, people who report to you. Delegate." "I'm still figuring that out." "Well, figure it faster, because if you burn out, I lose the best chief of staff I've ever had, and I'd really rather not have to replace you." She paused. "Also, I'm taking you to lunch. No arguments." "You don't have to, Ethan." She cut him off with a look. "Stop saying that. I want to. And honestly, I need to get out of this building before I lose my mind. Humor me." They ended up at a small bistro a few blocks from the office, the kind of place with outdoor seating and a menu written on a chalkboard. The autumn air was cool but not cold, perfect for sitting outside and watching the city move around them. Ava ordered a salad, Ethan got a sandwich, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, just existing in the same space without the pressure of performance. "Can I ask you something?" Ava said after a while. "Sure. What do you want? Long term, I mean, not just career-wise, in life." Ethan hadn't expected that. He picked at his sandwich, thinking, trying to formulate an answer that was honest without being pathetic. "I want Mia to have a good life, better than mine. I want her to have opportunities I didn't have, to not worry about money, or whether she's good enough, or if people will take her seriously." "That's not what I asked," Ava said gently. "I know." She waited, patient, giving him space to find the words. "I guess I want to feel like I'm not constantly on the edge of falling apart," he said finally. "Like I have a little breathing room. Like I can take Mia to get ice cream without checking my bank account first, or fix something when it breaks instead of trying to make it last another month." He paused, vulnerability making his voice rough. "And maybe I want to feel like I'm worth something. Not because of what I do for other people, but just because. Like I deserve to take up space in the world." Ava's gaze was steady, intense in a way that made him want to look away, but also made him feel seen in a way he never had before. "You are worth something, Ethan. You're worth a lot. And you deserve everything you just described, and more." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true. And I'll keep saying it until you believe it." She took a bite of her salad, chewed thoughtfully. "You know what I think your problem is?" "What?" "You've spent so long being told you're not enough that you started believing it, and now you're so used to being small that you don't know how to be anything else." She leaned forward. "But you're not small, Ethan. You never were. You were just in rooms full of people who needed you to be small so they could feel bigger." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. The words hit somewhere deep, touching something tender and bruised that he'd been protecting for years. They finished lunch and walked back to the office together, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Not contentment, exactly, but something close. Like maybe he was starting to believe what Ava kept telling him. Like maybe he was finally allowing himself to take up space. That evening, he picked Mia up from school, and she was unusually quiet on the drive home, staring out the window with an expression that looked too serious for a 7-year-old. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah." "You sure?" She nodded, but didn't elaborate. Ethan let it go, giving her space the way he'd learned to do. Sometimes Mia needed time to process before she could talk about what was bothering her. But when they got home and she went straight to her room without asking for a snack or turning on the TV, Ethan knew something was definitely wrong. He gave her 10 minutes, then knocked on her door. "Can I come in?" "Okay." She was sitting on her bed, hugging her stuffed rabbit, and Ethan's heart clenched at how small she looked. He sat beside her. "What's going on, sweetheart?" Mia was quiet for a long moment, her small face scrunched in concentration like she was trying to find the right words. A girl at school said her parents are getting divorced. Oh, that's hard for her. Yeah. Mia looked up at him with those too perceptive eyes. Are you sad that you and Mom got divorced? Ethan took a breath, treading carefully. Sometimes, but mostly I'm just glad we can both be happy now, even if it's not together. Mom seems really happy with Jonathan. She does. What about you? Are you happy? It was the second time in a week someone had asked him that, and Ethan was starting to realize he didn't have a simple answer. I'm happier than I was, and I think I'm going to keep getting happier. Because of Miss Sterling? Ethan almost laughed at how transparent he apparently was. Partly, yeah. She's helped me see myself differently, helped me believe I can do things I didn't think I could do. I like her, Mia said decisively. I think you should marry her. Whoa, slow down. We're just friends, sweetheart. But you like her, I can tell. Ethan couldn't deny that, so he didn't try. Yeah, I like her. Then you should tell her. It's not that simple. Why not? Because she's my boss, because I'm terrified of ruining the best thing that's happened to me in years. Because I don't know if what I'm feeling is real or just gratitude or desperation for connection. Because I've already failed at one relationship, and I'm not sure I trust myself to not fail again. Because grown-up stuff is complicated, Ethan said finally. Mia seemed to accept that, settling back against her pillows. Okay, but I still think you should tell her. That night, after Mia was asleep, Ethan sat on the couch with a beer he'd been saving for a bad day. He'd had plenty of bad days, but he'd never felt like he deserved to drink it. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like maybe he did deserve small pleasures, small moments of celebration. His phone rang just as he was opening the bottle. Ethan glanced at the screen, expecting spam or a wrong number. It was Ava. Hello? Hey, sorry to call so late. Am I interrupting anything? Just sitting here. What's up? I've been thinking. She paused, and Ethan could hear something in her voice he couldn't quite name. Nervousness, maybe. About what I said at lunch. About you being in rooms where people made you feel small. Yeah? I realized I might be one of those people. Not intentionally, but I've been your boss for 3 years, and for most of that time, I treated you like an assistant instead of a person. I gave you impossible schedules and last-minute tasks, and never asked if you had a life outside of making mine easier. She took a breath. And I'm sorry for that. Ethan didn't know what to say. Ava, you don't have to apologize. You've been great. You promoted me, gave me a raise. I did those things because I finally saw what I should have seen all along. But that doesn't excuse the 3 years before that. She paused again. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't want to be your boss anymore. Not just your boss, anyway. Ethan's heart was pounding. What do you mean? I mean, I value your opinion. I enjoy your company. And I think we could be... She stopped, seemed to reconsider. I'd like us to be friends. Real friends. Not just colleagues who occasionally have dinner. Friends. The word should have been disappointing, should have felt like a rejection of whatever he'd been hoping for. But instead, it felt like an invitation, like a door opening instead of closing. I'd like that too, Ethan said. Good. He could hear the smile in her voice. Then, as your friend, I'm telling you to take tomorrow off. Spend it with Mia. Do something fun. Stop working yourself to death. Ava, I'm serious. If you come into the office tomorrow, I'm sending you home. Ethan laughed despite himself. Okay, I'll take the day off. Good. I'll see you Monday. They hung up, and Ethan sat there in the dark, the beer forgotten, feeling like something fundamental had just shifted, even though he couldn't quite articulate what. The next morning, he took Mia to the Science Museum, a place she'd been begging to visit for months. They spent hours wandering through exhibits, touching interactive displays, watching demonstrations that made Mia gasp with wonder. In the afternoon, they went to the aquarium, pressing their faces against the glass to watch sharks glide past with prehistoric grace. Mia asked 1,000 questions. How did fish breathe underwater? Why were some octopuses poisonous? Did whales really sing to each other? And Ethan answered what he could and admitted when he didn't know. They had dinner at a burger place Mia loved, Nothing fancy, but the kind of place where the servers knew them by name and brought extra fries without being asked. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan felt present, not thinking about work or bills or whether he was doing enough. Just there, with his daughter, soaking in her joy like sunlight. That night, after Mia was asleep, Ethan stood in her doorway watching her breathe, wondering how he'd gotten so lucky to have this small person who loved him unconditionally, who believed he could do anything, who saw him as a hero even when he felt like a failure. He thought about Ava's words, about being worth something just because, about deserving to take up space. And for the first time, he started to believe it might be true. The following Monday, Ethan arrived at work to find an email from Ava marked urgent. "My office, now." His stomach dropped. Had he done something wrong? Missed something critical? Screwed up in some way he hadn't noticed? He knocked on her door, and she called for him to come in. She was standing by the window, looking out at the city, her posture tense. "Close the door," she said without turning around. He did, his pulse accelerating. When she finally turned to face him, her expression was serious, almost grim. "I got a call this weekend, from a board member." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What about?" "About us. Apparently there's been some concern about our relationship, about the dinner, about me promoting you, about whether I'm showing favoritism." She paused. "About whether we're too close." Ethan felt anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate. "That's ridiculous. I know. But perception matters, especially when you're a woman running a company, especially when people are looking for reasons to question your judgment." Ava's jaw tightened. "They're questioning my decision-making, and by extension, they're questioning whether you deserve your position." "What do they want?" "They want me to reconsider the dynamic, which is corporate speak for either distancing myself from you or finding a reason to let you go." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Are you going to?" Ava's gaze hardened, her eyes flashing with an anger that was fierce and protective. "Absolutely not. But if the board works for me, not the other way around." She stepped closer, her voice low and intense. "I built this company from nothing, Ethan. I fought for every dollar, every investor, every scrap of respect. I've been told no 1,000 times by men who thought they knew better. And I'm not going to let them tell me who I can and can't work with, who I can and can't trust, who matters and who doesn't." Ethan wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that she could fight this battle and win, but he'd learned a long time ago that wanting something didn't make it true. "What are you going to do?" he asked quietly. "I'm going to fight back, but I need to know you're with me." "Of course I am." Ava studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "This could get messy. They might dig into your background, your history with Claire, anything they can use to make you look unqualified or to suggest that I'm making decisions based on personal feelings rather than merit. Let them. I've got nothing to hide. I know, but I need you to be prepared for it. And I need you to know that whatever happens, this isn't your fault. It's politics. It's jealousy. It's people trying to control something they don't understand and can't stand not controlling." Ethan nodded, his chest tight with a mixture of fear and gratitude and something else he couldn't quite name. The week that followed was brutal. Ava spent hours in closed-door meetings with the board, her assistant fielding calls and rescheduling appointments, the entire office buzzing with speculation about what was happening behind those closed doors. Ethan tried to work, tried to focus on the tasks in front of him, but every time his phone buzzed, he braced for bad news. For the message that said it was over, that the board had won, that he was being let go for the sake of appearances and corporate politics. But the message never came. Instead, on Thursday afternoon, Ava called him into her office again, and this time she was smiling. "Sit," she said, and her tone was lighter than it had been all week. Ethan sat, his hands clenched in his lap, afraid to hope. "I talked to the board," Ava said, settling into her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just won a battle. "And I made them an offer they couldn't refuse." "What kind of offer?" "I told them if they had a problem with you being my chief of staff, they could vote to remove me as CEO. And if they did that, I'd take my equity, my intellectual property, my relationships with our key investors, and I'd start over somewhere else." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with triumph. I told them they could have a company without me, or they could have a company with both of us. Their choice. Ethan's eyes went wide. Ava, you didn't actually. I did, she smiled. And you know what? They folded, immediately, because they know I'm not bluffing. They know losing me would tank their stock value, would send our investors running, would destroy everything we've built. She paused. Turns out, being indispensable has its perks. Ethan didn't know what to say. The fact that she'd risked everything, her company, her career, her reputation, for him was overwhelming in a way that made it hard to breathe. Why would you do that? He asked, his voice rough. Because it's the right thing to do. Because you've earned your position 100 times over. Because I'm tired of watching good people get pushed aside by politics and prejudice, and people who care more about control than competence. She paused, her expression softening. And because you matter to me, Ethan, not just as an employee, as a person, as someone I respect and value and refuse to let anyone diminish. Ethan's throat was tight, his eyes burning. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep being excellent. Keep proving them wrong just by existing. By Friday, the crisis had passed. The board issued a quiet statement reaffirming their confidence in Ava's leadership, in her decision-making, in the direction of the company. No one mentioned Ethan directly, which was fine. He didn't need recognition. He just needed to keep his job, to keep providing for Mia, to keep building this new life he was starting to believe in. That evening, Ethan picked Mia up from school, and she was practically vibrating with excitement. Guess what, Daddy? What? Mrs. Patterson said my art is good enough to be in the school show, the one where parents come and everything. Ethan felt his chest swell with pride. That's amazing, sweetheart. When is it? Next Friday. Can you come? Of course I can come. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Mia beamed, chattering the entire drive home about which drawing she was going to submit, what she was going to wear, whether there would be cookies at the show. And Ethan listened, really listened, soaking in her joy and letting it fill the spaces in his chest that had been empty for too long. That night, after Mia was asleep, his phone buzzed with a text from Ava. Crisis averted. Board back down. You're safe. Ethan stared at this message, relief washing over him so intensely it made him dizzy. He typed back, Thank you for everything, for fighting for me. Her response came quickly. Always. That's what friends do. Friends. The word still felt insufficient for what they were becoming, but it was a start, a foundation to build on. The art show the following Friday was held in the school gymnasium, which had been transformed with student artwork covering every available surface. Parents milled around with plastic cups of punch, admiring crayon drawings and construction paper collages with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for professional galleries. Ethan found Mia's drawing on the far wall, a watercolor of their house, complete with the garden they didn't have and the dog she still wanted. It was childish and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. Daddy! He turned to find Mia running toward him, her face flushed with excitement. Behind her, walking more slowly, was Ava. Ethan's heart skipped. Ava, what are you doing here? Mia invited me, Ava said, smiling. She sent me a very official invitation. How could I refuse? Mia grabbed both their hands, pulling them toward her artwork. Come see my painting. They stood together in front of the drawing, and Ava studied it with the same serious attention she gave investor presentations. It's wonderful, Mia, she said finally. You're very talented. Mia beamed, and Ethan felt something shift in his chest. This moment, the three of them standing together, Mia proud and happy, Ava choosing to be here even though she had no obligation, felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. After the show, they went out for ice cream, all three of them piling into Ethan's dented sedan because Ava insisted it would be more fun. Mia sat in the back, telling Ava everything she knew about colors and painting techniques, while Ava listened with genuine interest and asked questions that made Mia light up even more. They ended up at the same shop Ethan and Mia always went to, and this time when the server brought their orders, Ethan didn't feel self-conscious about the cheap vinyl booths or the chipped tables. Because Ava was laughing at something Mia said, completely at ease, and it didn't matter where they were. What mattered was being together. Thank you for coming tonight, Ethan said once Mia had run off to look at the display of toppings. It meant a lot. To both of us. I wanted to be here, Ava said simply. Mia's important to you, which makes her important to me. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something in her expression that made his heart race. Something that looked like more than friendship, more than professional respect, more than kindness. Ava, I know what you're going to say, she interrupted gently, and I need you to let me say something first. Okay. She took a breath, her fingers fidgeting with her napkin in a display of nervousness he'd never seen from her before. I've spent most of my adult life keeping people at arm's length, building walls, protecting myself from getting hurt or disappointed or vulnerable. And it's worked, mostly. I've built a successful company, made smart decisions, stayed focused on what matters. She paused. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what it feels like to connect with someone. Really connect. Not as a boss or a CEO or someone who has to maintain an image, just as a person. Ethan's throat was tight. Ava, let me finish. She smiled, but her eyes were serious. You've reminded me what that feels like. Being around you, watching you with Mia, seeing how hard you work and how much you care. It's reminded me that success means nothing if you don't have people to share it with. People who see you, really see you, and still choose to stick around. I'm not going anywhere, Ethan said quietly. Good, because I don't want you to. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. I don't know what this is exactly, and I'm not asking you to define it or rush into anything, but I need you to know that you matter to me, more than an employee, more than a friend, and if you're open to seeing where that goes. I am, Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. I really, really am. Ava's smile was genuine, reaching her eyes, transforming her entire face. Then, let's see where it goes. Mia returned to the table at that moment, oblivious to what had just happened, chattering about wanting to try every topping in the store. And Ethan sat there with his daughter on one side and Ava on the other, feeling like maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found what he'd been looking for all along. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, just connection. Just people who saw him and valued him and chose to be in his life anyway. 6 months later, Ethan stood in his small backyard, watching Mia chase fireflies in the fading light of a summer evening. Ava was beside him, her hand in his, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. It hadn't been easy. There had been awkward conversations about boundaries, about how to navigate a relationship when they also worked together, about what it meant for Mia to see her father dating someone. There had been moments of doubt, times when the old fears crept in and whispered that he didn't deserve this, that it would all fall apart eventually. But they'd worked through it, slowly, carefully, with honesty and patience and the kind of communication Ethan had never managed with Claire. And somewhere along the way, his house had stopped feeling empty. Ava's presence had filled spaces he hadn't known were hollow, not because she'd moved in or changed anything fundamental, but because she'd chosen to be part of his life in ways that mattered. Daddy, Miss Ava, look, Mia called out, cupping her hands around a firefly. I caught one. I see it, sweetheart, Ethan called back, watching as she opened her hands and let the insect float away into the darkening sky. Ava squeezed his hand, and he looked at her. Really looked at her. This woman who'd seen him at his lowest and decided he was worth fighting for, who'd risked her career to protect his, who'd chosen to be here in his messy, imperfect life, even though she could have had anything, anyone. Happy? She asked. Yeah, Ethan said, and meant it completely. I am. Because happiness wasn't about having everything. It wasn't about being perfect or having unlimited resources or never struggling. It was about moments like this, watching his daughter chase fireflies, holding hands with someone who saw him, really saw him, and still chose to stay, believing finally that he was enough exactly as he was. The wedding invitation had been a test Ethan hadn't known he was taking. Walking into that room, surrounded by people who'd made it clear he didn't measure up, had forced him to confront the story he'd been telling himself for years, that he was a failure, that he'd never be enough, that his worth was measured by what he could provide rather than who he was. But Ava had shown him something different. She'd shown him that worth wasn't something he had to earn or prove. It was something he already had always had, buried under years of other people's judgments and his own internalized shame. And the truth was, he'd been carrying Mia on his shoulders the whole time, working multiple jobs when he'd had to, sacrificing sleep and comfort and any semblance of a social life to make sure she had what she needed. Showing up day after day, even when it hurt, even when he felt like he was drowning, even when no one was watching or acknowledging or giving him credit. That was strength. That was worth. That was everything that mattered. A year after that first dinner at Marcello's, Ethan stood in a different venue, smaller, quieter, filled with people who actually mattered instead of people who wanted to be seen. Mia was the flower girl, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself, grinning as she scattered petals down an aisle lined with chairs borrowed from the office. Ava waited at the front, her eyes shining, wearing a simple dress that probably cost a fortune but looked like it could have come from anywhere because what mattered wasn't the dress, but the woman wearing it. It wasn't a perfect story. There were still hard conversations with Claire about custody and co-parenting. Still moments when Ethan's old insecurities flared up, when he wondered if he deserved this happiness, if it would all come crashing down. Still days when balancing work and fatherhood and this new relationship felt impossible. But perfection had never been the point. The point was showing up, choosing vulnerability over protection, letting people in, even when it scared him, building a life based on connection rather than survival. As Ethan slid the ring onto Ava's finger, he looked into her eyes and saw his future. Not a rescue, not a fairy tale. Just two people who'd found each other in the mess of life and decided to build something real. Mia clapped louder than anyone when they kissed, and Ethan laughed, pulling her into a hug that included Ava, the three of them standing there together while their small gathering of friends and family applauded. "We did it, Daddy," Mia whispered. "Did what, sweetheart?" "Found our family." Ethan looked at Ava, who was smiling through tears, and felt his chest swell with something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the kind that depended on circumstances changing or luck breaking his way, but the kind that came from knowing he was enough, exactly as he was. That he'd been enough all along. That worth wasn't something he had to earn. It was something he'd always had, waiting for him to recognize it. The reception was small, intimate. Friends from work who'd become actual friends. Neighbors who'd watched Mia grow up and supported Ethan through the hard years. Mrs. Alvarez, who cried happy tears and told him she'd always known things would work out. A few family members who actually cared, who'd shown up when it mattered. Claire came, surprisingly. She brought Jonathan, and they stayed for exactly one drink before making polite excuses to leave. But before she went, Claire pulled Ethan aside, away from the celebration. "I'm happy for you," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. "You deserve this." "Thanks, Claire. I know I didn't always make you feel that way. When we were together, I mean. I was so focused on what I thought I needed, what I thought success looked like, that I didn't see what was right in front of me." She paused. "You're a good person, Ethan. I hope you know that now." Ethan nodded, accepting the apology he'd stopped waiting for years ago, feeling the last piece of old bitterness dissolve. "Take care of yourself, Claire. You too, and her." She glanced at Ava, who was laughing at something Mia had said. "She's good for you. Don't mess it up." "I'll try not to." Claire left, and Ethan returned to Ava's side, where he belonged, where he'd chosen to be and been chosen in return. As the evening wound down, Ethan found himself on a small balcony overlooking the city, watching lights flicker in the distance like earthbound stars. Ava joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How different things are now. How different I am." "You're the same person you always were. You just stopped hiding. You just started believing what everyone else could already see." Ethan turned to face her, pulling her close. "You make it sound easy." "It's not easy, but it's worth it." She paused, her expression serious. "You taught me that, you know. I spent so long building walls, protecting myself, that I forgot what it felt like to let someone in, to trust someone with the messy parts, not just the polished surface." "I think we taught each other," Ethan said. "Maybe we did." They stood there for a while, wrapped in each other, and Ethan realized something. This was what winning looked like. Not the promotion or the raise or the people who'd finally started treating him with respect. This. The quiet moments, the shared glances, the knowledge that he wasn't alone anymore, that he'd never really been alone, that he'd just been too scared to reach out. 2 years later, Ethan sat at Mia's school assembly, watching her accept an award for her artwork. She'd grown so much, become so confident, secure in a way that made his chest ache with pride and relief. Ava sat beside him, her hand in his, and when Mia looked out into the audience and waved, they both waved back. After the ceremony, Mia ran to them, clutching her certificate like treasure. "Did you see? Did you see?" "We saw," Ethan said, scooping her up even though she was getting too big for it. "You were amazing." "I couldn't have done it without you, Daddy. You always believed in me." Ethan's eyes stung. "I always will, sweetheart. Always." That evening, they went out for ice cream to celebrate, the three of them piling into a better car than Ethan used to have, but still nothing fancy, because fancy had never been the point. Mia ordered her usual chocolate with sprinkles, and Ethan and Ava shared a sundae, listening to Mia chatter about her plans for the summer, the art classes she wanted to take, the dog she still occasionally lobbied for. On the drive home, Mia fell asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window, small snores filling the comfortable silence. Ava glanced back at her, smiling. "She's something special." "Yeah, she is." "You both are." Ava reached over, taking Ethan's hand. "I love you." "I love you too." It was simple, uncomplicated, the kind of love that didn't need grand gestures or perfect moments. It just needed showing up, day after day, choosing each other, building something real in the space between who they'd been and who they were becoming. As they pulled into the driveway of the house they now shared, Ethan's small house that had somehow expanded to fit all of them, he looked at the porch light Ava had left on, at the flowers she'd planted in the garden Mia had drawn years ago, at the life they'd built together from imperfect pieces, and he realized he'd finally learned what he'd been searching for all along. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to prove his worth to people who'd never see it. He didn't need to shrink himself to fit into spaces that were too small for him. He just needed to be himself, flawed, human, trying his best, showing up every day with honesty and effort and love. And that was the most powerful thing he could be. As they got Mia inside and tucked her into bed, as Ava kissed his daughter's forehead and whispered goodnight, as they stood together in the doorway watching her sleep, Ethan felt complete in a way he never had before. This was home. Not the building or the address or the stuff inside. This, the people who chose to be here, the love that filled the spaces between words, the knowledge that he was seen and valued and enough. He'd walked into Claire's wedding feeling invisible, feeling small, feeling like he'd failed at everything that mattered, and he'd walked out with Ava beside him, starting to believe that maybe he hadn't failed at all, that maybe he'd just been telling himself the wrong story. The real story was this: Ethan Cole was a good father, a good partner, a good person. Not because of his job title or his salary or what other people thought of him, but because he showed up, because he cared, because he kept going even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And in the end, that was all that mattered. That was everything.